My name is Susan Whitaker. I'm 68 years old, and 3 weeks after I buried my husband of 44 years, my own son changed the locks and set my suitcase in the elevator like it was garbage. Jonathan looked at me and said, "Useless old woman. Figure it out yourself." The will gave him the penthouse. It gave me one line, a rundown garage on the edge of town. Everyone in that lawyer's office had smirked. I drove there at midnight because I had nowhere else to go. I expected cobwebs and a leaking roof. Then the door rolled up and the motion lights came on one by one, over 3 cars worth $12 million and an envelope with my name in Robert's handwriting. What my son threw away that night wasn't a garage. The rain had stopped by the time we buried Robert, but the ground at Fairview Memorial was still soft enough that my heels sank into it. I remember that more than I remember the eulogy. I remember the sound the shovel made against the loose dirt, a wet, patient sound, like something folding itself closed. Jonathan stood on my left in a black suit that fit him better than it should have, given how quickly he'd had it altered. He held my elbow the way you hold something you're studying for photographs. When people came up to me, he answered for me. "She's tired," he said. "She's not really up for talking." I was standing right there. I could talk. I just hadn't been asked to. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that smelled like the coffee Marcus Bell's assistant kept refilling and never drinking herself, we sat in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building on Kessler Avenue for the reading of the will. Jonathan sat with his ankle crossed over his knee, tapping a pen against a legal pad he hadn't written on. Priya sat beside him in a gray coat, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. Marcus Bell is 58, silver at the temples, the kind of lawyer who takes off his glasses before he says something he knows will land hard. He took them off then. To my son, Jonathan Robert Whitaker, he read, "I leave the penthouse at Adler Place, in its entirety, along with the furnishings therein." Jonathan's jaw didn't move, but something behind his eyes settled, the way a man's shoulders drop when a debt is finally paid to him instead of by him. "To my wife, Susan Whitaker," Marcus continued, and here his voice changed pace, slowed, like he was walking across ice. "I leave the garage property located at 214 Delmont Road and its full contents." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Jonathan let out a breath through his nose that was almost a laugh, caught and swallowed halfway. "A garage," he said. "Dad left her a garage." Priya's hand found his sleeve. "Jonathan." "What?" "I'm just saying what's written." He looked at me, and there was no cruelty in his face yet, not the kind that would come later that night, just a kind of pity that was somehow worse. "Mom, I'm sure there's more." "Isn't there more, Marcus?" "That's what the document specifies," Marcus said. "So, the penthouse we all picked out together, the one on the river, and she gets a garage." Jonathan shook his head, not quite looking at me. "No offense, Mom." "None taken," I said, though I hadn't been given room to say anything else. Marcus set his glasses back on the table, without putting them on. "Your father spent a long time with this document, Jonathan. Longer than most men spend on a will their size." "Sure," Jonathan said, already reaching for his coat. "Sure he did." I sat there holding a coffee cup that had gone cold, doing the arithmetic that widows do without meaning to. 44 years married. A penthouse with a view of the river we'd picked out together in 1994. A garage on the edge of town I couldn't remember Robert ever once mentioning. When the room emptied out, Marcus caught my arm gently at the door, out of Jonathan's earshot. He looked at me a beat too long.
"Susan," he said.
Robert chose every word in that document very carefully. Every single one. He paused like he wanted to say more and then didn't. "Take the garage key. Go when you're ready. Not before." "Marcus, what does that mean?" "It means take the key," he said, pressing it into my palm and folding my fingers over it himself, "and don't let anyone talk you out of going." I didn't understand him. I put the key in my coat pocket and went back to the penthouse to start packing up Robert's closet because grief needed somewhere to put its hands, and folding his sweater seemed as good a place as any. I was in the walk-in closet, one of his flannel shirts pressed to my face, when the intercom buzzed downstairs. I checked the clock on his nightstand. 8:40 in the evening. Too late for casseroles. Too early for anyone I knew to come by uninvited. I walked to the panel by the door, wiped my eyes with the back of my wrist, and pressed the button, already composing some tired, grateful thing to say to whichever neighbor had come to check on the widow. "Mrs. Whitaker?" a man's voice said. "I'm here about the locks. Mr. Whitaker called it in for tonight." The elevator light glinted off Priya's water glass on the kitchen island. She hadn't moved from that stool in an hour. Watching me fold Robert's cardigans into a box like folding felt normal. "Mr. Whitaker called it in for tonight," the locksmith said again, holding his drill against his hip like he needed permission to start. He was young, maybe 25, with a canvas belt of brass cylinders slung across his chest, and he kept glancing at me the way people glance at a dog they're not sure is friendly. Jonathan came around the corner, buttoning his cuff. "Go ahead," he told him. "Both locks. Deadbolt, too." "Jonathan." I set the cardigan down. "It's 9 o'clock at night. It's 8:40. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at his phone. The drill bit into the strike plate on the front door, a high-thin whine that filled the whole apartment, and under it I heard Priya's stool scrape back an inch, then stop. She didn't get up. "You understand this is still my home," I said. "I've lived here since 1994. Your father." "My father left the penthouse to me. That's what the will says." That's what Marcus read out loud this morning, in front of everyone. He finally looked up. "You got the garage, Mom. This is mine now." The drill stopped. The locksmith crouched, fitting a new brass cylinder into the door, and the silence after the noise felt worse than the noise had. I could hear the refrigerator humming. I could hear my own pulse somewhere behind my ears. "Priya," I said, because I needed one person in that room to say something human. "Can you talk to him?" Priya's mouth opened. For a second, I thought she might. Her fingers tightened around the water glass, knuckles going pale, and she looked at Jonathan. Really looked, the way a wife looks at a husband when she's deciding whether tonight is the night she spends her one argument. Then she looked down at the granite countertop. "Jonathan," she said quietly. Maybe she could stay in the guest room. Just till she finds somewhere.
"No."
He didn't raise his voice. That was the thing about Jonathan I never got used to, even after 39 years of knowing him. He never needed volume. "This isn't a hotel." Priya didn't say it again. She turned the water glass a quarter turn on the granite, watching the ring of condensation it left behind, and I understood something had shifted in her that she hadn't decided what to do with yet. The locksmith finished the deadbolt, packed his drill into a canvas bag, and Jonathan signed something on a clipboard without reading it. Then he walked to the coat closet, pulled out my 2 suitcases, already packed, because some instinct in me had packed them hours ago, before I'd let myself believe I'd need to, and set them by the elevator. On top of them, he placed the canvas tote holding my mother's quilting fabric, the squares I'd carried out of every house I'd ever lived in, folded corner to corner the way she taught me when I was 9 years old. "Take the elevator down," he said. "It's already called." I stood in the hallway holding nothing, because he'd already taken the suitcases out of my hands before I'd thought to reach for them. "One night," I said. "I'm asking for one night, Jonathan. I buried your father 3 weeks ago." He pressed the elevator button. The doors opened, that small chime sounding almost polite. He nudged the suitcases inside with his foot. "Useless old woman," he said, not loud, not cruel-sounding even, just tired, like I was a chore he wanted finished. "Figure it out yourself." The doors closed between us. I watched my own reflection slide across the brushed steel until it disappeared. Downstairs, in the lobby, I sat on the bench near the mailboxes with the phone in my lap. "Fairview Suites, how can I help you?" A voice said, cheerful and far away, and I asked the rate before I'd even said hello properly. $340 a night, ma'am, plus tax." I thanked her and hung up before she could ask if I wanted to book. I called 3 more places from memory, numbers I still had in an address book because Robert liked paper, and none of them were cheaper. I had $1,200 in my checking account, and a credit card Jonathan's name was also on. I called him once. It rang twice and went silent, not voicemail, just silence, the sound of someone declining a call on purpose. I sat there a long moment with the phone still against my ear, listening to nothing. Then I opened my purse and found the folded paper Marcus had pressed into my hand that morning outside the conference room. 214 Delmont Road. Below the address, in his neat lawyer's handwriting, "When you're ready." I hadn't expected to be ready tonight. I loaded the suitcases into the trunk of my Buick, the one Robert bought used in 2011 because I'd always hated driving anything flashy, and I pulled out of the Adler Place garage into a city gone quiet and orange under the streetlights. The drive took 40 minutes. Delmont Road turned out to be a stretch of low industrial buildings on the edge of town, dark except for one security light buzzing over a corrugated steel door. The garage itself looked exactly like what Jonathan had implied it was, rusted along the bottom edge, paint peeling in long gray strips, the kind of place you'd expect to find a lawnmower and a stack of paint cans. But bolted beside the door, gleaming under that one buzzing light, was a keypad. Brand new. Its small screen glowed pale blue in the dark, waiting for a code. The paper Marcus had pressed into my hand at the office read like nothing. 9 digits, no explanation. I typed them into the keypad now, my finger unsteady in the cold. The screen blinked green. Somewhere behind the rusted panel, a motor groaned to life. The door didn't creak open the way I expected. It rolled up smooth and silent, a sound like a held breath being let out slowly, and rows of overhead lights woke one after another, marching back into the dark like something counting itself awake. I stood there with my hand still on the keypad. It wasn't a garage. It was a room built to look like one from the outside and be something else entirely on the inside, polished concrete floor, the kind that catches light. And parked in 3 careful bays, nose out, was a silver car I didn't have a name for yet, a low black one with wings that opened straight up like a beetle's shell, and a red one so clean it looked wet. "Robert," I said, out loud to no one. I walked in slowly, the way you walk into a church you weren't raised in. My shoes clicked on the concrete. There was a workbench along the far wall, tools hung in outlines like a shadow box, a filing cabinet with a brass lock, and a desk with a single lamp already plugged in, as if someone had known I'd need light. I found the plaque bolted to the black one first. Mercedes-Benz 300 SL, it read, and a year I couldn't process. The red one was a Ferrari 250, hand-lettered on an index card taped to the dash like Robert hadn't trusted a metal plaque to say it plainly enough. The silver one was an Aston Martin DB5, and I laughed once, short and strange, because I remembered him watching an old spy film on a Sunday afternoon 15 years ago and saying, "Someday, Susie, someday," and I'd thought he meant the movie. He hadn't been talking about the movie. On the desk, square in the lamplight, sat an envelope. My name on the front in his handwriting, the slanted S he never fixed no matter how many times I teased him about it. I sat down in the chair. It was cold through my coat. My hands weren't steady when I opened it. "Susan, if you're reading this, you found the code, which means Marcus did his job, which means you're standing in the one room of my life I never showed you on purpose. I found out about my heart 9 years ago. Dr. Aldrich on Kessler Avenue gave me a number I didn't like, and I decided not to give it to you. You would have wrapped my life in bubble wrap, and I would have let you, and we would have spent whatever time I had left being careful instead of being married. So, I built this instead. Quietly. On weekends I told you were fishing trips. I was here, restoring these 3, learning what they were worth, understanding what it would mean to leave them to someone who'd actually see them." I stopped there and pressed the back of my hand to my mouth. A fishing trip. 41 of them over 9 years by my count, and I used to pack him sandwiches for the drive. There was more. I need you to know something about Jonathan, and I need you to hear it from me and not decide it on your own, because it's going to look cruel before it looks like anything else. I've watched him for a long time. The way he talks about money like it's the only language worth learning. The way he started talking about you, not to your face, but around you, like you're a line item he's waiting to close out. I don't think he's a lost cause. I think he's a man who has never once been told no by anything that mattered, and I couldn't fix that from a hospital bed with a clock running. So I left him the penthouse. Let him have it in full view of everyone. Let him win something that looks enormous. It is a test, Susan. Not a cruel one, I hope. A true one. I want to see, without me in the room to soften it, who he is when he thinks there's nothing left to perform for. Everything that matters, the cars, the properties, the rest, it's yours. Not through the will everyone read out loud in that office. Through something Marcus built for you alone, something Jonathan can't touch, argue with, or talk his way into. There's a trust, Susan, a real one, with a shape I haven't put on paper here. I'll let Marcus explain the mechanics of it. He knows more than I could fit in one letter without my hand cramping. I stopped again because the next line was underlined, and Robert never underlined anything. Robert circled things twice if he was serious. An underline meant he'd written it while something in his chest was already telling him to hurry. One more thing, and I need you to actually do this, not just agree with it and then call him tomorrow because you feel guilty. Don't tell Jonathan anything. Let him show you exactly who he really is. I sat with the letter in my lap for a long while. The lamp hummed. Somewhere behind me, one of the overhead lights ticked as it cooled, the only sound in a room built to hold 3 fortunes and one very careful goodbye. I hadn't cried at the funeral. Not really. I'd stood in my black coat and shaken hands and thanked people for casseroles I never ate. But I cried now, sitting in a dead man's borrowed chair, surrounded by cars he'd loved in secret, holding a letter that told me my husband had spent 9 years dying quietly so he could protect me from our own son. I folded it along its creases, the way he would have. Then I noticed, tucked behind where the letter had sat, a second smaller envelope, sealed, with only 3 words written across the front in that same slanted hand. Not yet, Marcus. The office at Kessler Avenue smelled like paper and cold coffee. I sat in the same chair as 3 weeks ago, when the words, "a garage on Delmont Road," had felt like a slap. Now the chair felt different.
So did I.
Marcus set 2 folders on the desk, squared them with his fingertips, and didn't open either one yet. "How was the drive?" he said. Not really a question. "Long," I said. "The gate code worked." "I know." He almost smiled. "Robert made me test it myself. Twice." I folded my hands in my lap the way my mother taught me before church, before bad news, before anything that needed a steady face. "Marcus, tell me what I'm looking at." He opened the first folder. Inside was a single typed page, and beneath it, a stack thick enough to need a rubber band. "The will you heard read 3 weeks ago," he said, "is real. Legally binding. Jonathan owns the Adler Place penthouse outright. That part was never a trick." Then what was? The idea that it was the inheritance. He turned the page toward me. "Susan, Robert bought that penthouse in 1994. It's worth a great deal on paper. It also has a mortgage he took against it 11 years ago, a maintenance assessment coming due in the spring, and a building board that's been trying to push out long-term owners for a tax reassessment. It is, in Robert's words, he tapped a line I hadn't reached yet, a beautiful problem." I read it. Robert's handwriting, small and even, the way he wrote grocery lists. A beautiful problem, Susie. Let him have it and see what he does with a problem dressed as a prize. Something in my chest loosened and tightened at the same time. "And the garage," I said. Marcus pulled the second folder closer, but didn't open it yet. The garage was never the gift either. It was the door. To what? He turned it around. The first page was a trust document, dense with clauses, my name typed at the top in a font too formal for someone who still hemmed her own curtains. The Susan R. Whitaker Irrevocable Trust. 3 vehicles, Marcus said, sliding a photograph across, the Aston Martin under the shop light, the Gullwing's doors caught mid-lift like wings. Appraised together at $11.4 million, though the last 2 auctions in that category ran higher. A rental property portfolio, 6 units, all leased, all current, call it $18,000 a month in income. A brokerage account Robert built quietly for 11 years. And a house. A house. Carmel. Fully furnished. Robert closed on it 4 years ago and never told either of us he'd bought it. He slid a set of keys across the desk, a small brass fob shaped like a shell. "It's yours. Has been since the day he signed this." I looked at the keys longer than I needed to. I was aware of the second hand moving on the clock behind Marcus's head, aware of my own pulse in my ears, aware that I hadn't cried yet and didn't trust myself not to now. "Why like this?" I said finally. "Why the garage? Why not just tell me?" Marcus leaned back. For the first time since I'd known him, 22 years, every Christmas dinner, every hospital waiting room, he looked tired in a way that wasn't about paperwork. "Because he was afraid," he said, "that if Jonathan knew what you actually had, he would find a way to get his hands on it.
Through you.
Around you. However he could." He paused. Robert didn't want to believe that about his own son. But he wasn't a fool, Susan. He watched him for years. The way Jonathan talked about you at dinners. The way he talked about money, period. I thought of Jonathan's voice in the hallway 3 nights ago. "Useless old woman. Figure it out yourself." I hadn't told Marcus that part. I didn't need to. I could see in his face that he already knew, or had guessed close enough. "So the penthouse was bait," I said. "The penthouse was a test." Marcus's voice was quiet now. Robert wanted to see what Jonathan would do if he believed he'd won and you'd lost. Whether he'd take care of his mother anyway. Out of decency. Not because the will demanded it, because there was nothing left demanding it. He looked at me steadily. "You have your answer now. I'm sorry it's the one you got." I didn't say anything for a moment. Outside the window, a delivery truck idled, someone's radio bleeding faintly through the glass. "This trust," I said. "Can Jonathan touch it? Contest it? Freeze it? Anything?"
No.
"It's irrevocable, structured with a spendthrift clause and an independent trustee, me, specifically to prevent exactly what you're asking." Robert had me draft 3 separate versions before he was satisfied it was airtight. He used the words, "nothing he can bend," more than once. Marcus slid the folder fully across to me. "He built you a wall, Susan. Not a garage. A wall." I thought about the sedan in the parking garage on Adler Place, the one I'd been driving for 11 years, bought used in 2011 with money I'd saved teaching quilting classes at the community center. I thought about how, 3 weeks ago, I had $1,200 left in savings after the funeral costs, and a hotel room at $340 a night I couldn't afford for more than a night or two. And now there was a shell-shaped key in my hand for a house I'd never seen. "He knew he was dying," I said. "For how long?" 9 years. Marcus said it plainly, the way you'd read out a birth date. "Since the first cardiac event. He told you it was a mild scare and a change in diet. It wasn't. The fishing trips," I said slowly. "The golf. The business dinners on Tuesdays." Marcus didn't look away. 41 appointments, Susan. In 9 years. He kept a private log. I only found it going through his files last week. 41. I did the math without meaning to, nearly 1 every 10 weeks for almost a decade, and had to set the shell key down on the desk because my hand had started to shake in a way that embarrassed me. He had sat across from me at breakfast 41 mornings after, buttering toast, telling me the fish weren't biting. Marcus reached over and closed his hand briefly over mine, just once, the way you'd steady a glass about to tip. "There's more in the second envelope," he said. "Robert asked me to hold it until you'd absorbed this part. I think you have." He was reaching for it when his phone buzzed against the desk, face up, and he glanced at it the way people do out of habit before deciding whether it matters. This time it clearly did. His jaw shifted. He turned the phone face down before he'd even finished reading it. "Marcus." "What?" He sat very still for a moment, choosing his words the way he chose everything, carefully, like a man laying out tools he might need later. "Someone called me this morning," he said, "asking about a garage on Delmont Road. Whether it was registered to Robert Whitaker's estate." He looked up at me, and for the first time all morning, there was no calm in it at all. "Susan, that is not a name that should have crossed anyone's desk but mine and yours. Someone already knows it exists, and they should not." The house in Carmel sat on a bluff above a cove called Whale Watch Point, and the first morning I woke there, I did not know where I was for almost a full minute. The ceiling was wrong. The light was wrong. It came in low and gray gold through a window that faced water instead of the air shaft I'd stared at for 30 years in Adler Place. I lay still and listened. No traffic.
No elevaterum.
Just gulls, and something that took me a moment to place is surf. Marcus had arranged everything before I arrived. Utilities on, refrigerator stocked, a folder on the kitchen counter with deed copies, insurance numbers, a laminated card with 3 phone numbers under the words, "If you need anything, call any of these." I hadn't asked for that. I stood in the kitchen that first morning holding the card and thinking that Robert had built a net under me 9 years before I fell. I did not cry. I made coffee in a pot I didn't recognize, in a kitchen that was mine, and I drank it standing at the window watching the water change color. The knock came on the 3rd day. I opened the door expecting a delivery. Instead there was a woman, silver-haired, maybe 66, wearing a canvas jacket and holding a casserole dish with both hands like she wasn't sure I'd take it. "I'm Eleanor Voss," she said. "I live 2 houses down, the blue one with the bad gutters. I used to run the collections department at the Lars Auto Museum up in Monterey, and I have been dying of curiosity since a flatbed truck delivered 3 canvas-covered cars to your garage on Tuesday." I laughed. It surprised me how easily it came. "Come in," I said. "I'll tell you, but I should warn you, it's a long story and I don't fully believe it myself yet." She sat at my kitchen table for 2 hours. I told her about Robert, about the garage, about the letter, leaving out the numbers because some things still felt too raw to say out loud. She didn't push. When I finally walked her out to the garage and lifted the door, she went quiet in a way I recognized, the quiet of someone doing arithmetic they don't want to say aloud in front of a stranger. "Do you know what you have here?" she asked. Marcus told me a number. I keep forgetting it on purpose. The DB5 alone. She crouched by the front wheel, not touching, just looking. "Susan, these need climate control, not just a locked door. And that Ferrari's tires are original. You cannot drive on those, they'll crack. I can help you find someone who does this properly. I know people." "Why would you help me? You just met me." She looked up at me with an expression I'd see many more times over the coming months, dry, direct, unbothered by softening the truth. "Because you made me laugh about your dead husband's secret garage within an hour of meeting you, and because I have spent 11 years around people who inherited beautiful things and had no idea what they were holding. I'd rather help someone who's honest about not knowing." That was the beginning of it. Eleanor brought a mechanic named Ferris who specialized in pre-war and mid-century restorations, and I stood in my own garage taking notes like I was back in a classroom, because I was 68 years old, and I decided I would rather ask questions than pretend. The weeks folded into each other differently than they had in the city. I unpacked the quilting supplies I'd carried out of Adler Place in that rushed, humiliating hour, and I set up a table by the window with a good light. My hands remembered the rhythm before my mind caught up, needle down, needle up, the small percussive give of fabric under thread. I hadn't quilted anything but repairs and gifts in 15 years. I started a new piece with no occasion in mind at all, which felt like its own kind of rebellion. Eleanor taught me to drive the Aston Martin on a Sunday when the coast road was empty. I stalled it twice. The 3rd time, I got it into 3rd gear on a straight stretch above the water, and something in my chest loosened that I hadn't known was clenched. "There she is," Eleanor said from the passenger seat, not looking at me, looking at the road. "That's the woman who was in there the whole time." I didn't answer her. I was too busy noticing that for the first time in longer than I could measure, I was not managing anyone's mood, not anticipating anyone's needs, not making myself smaller in a room. I was just driving a car my husband had loved enough to hide for 9 years, toward a coastline I now called home. It was late September when I first noticed the sedan. Gray, nondescript, parked across the road near the Hendersons' fence line. I noticed it because it was there on a Tuesday and still there on Thursday in roughly the same spot, and because the man behind the wheel seemed to be doing nothing at all, no phone, no newspaper, no dog to walk. I mentioned it to Eleanor over tea. "Could be a surveyor," she said, but she was frowning at her cup, not at me. "Or it could be someone with more interest in your garage than the county assessor. You said Jonathan called Marcus twice last month asking what the cars were worth." "He asked what they were worth." "That's what Marcus told me." She set the cup down. "Susan, I sat behind a locked case with a Dwessenberg in it for 6 years. I know what people do when they think $11 million is sitting somewhere unguarded." We let it go that afternoon, but I found myself glancing at the road more than I used to. Then came the calls. My new phone, the one Marcus had set up with a caramel number nobody should have had yet, rang twice in 1 week from numbers I didn't recognize. The first time, I let it go to voicemail and nothing was left. The second time I answered, and there was a pause before a man's voice asked, carefully, almost gently, "Is this Mrs. Whitaker? Robert Whitaker's widow? I understand you may have some vehicles stored on the property. I'm calling about a garage inspection." "There's no inspection scheduled," I said. "Who is this?" The line went dead. I stood in my kitchen with the phone still warm against my ear, my pulse ticking harder than the words deserved. No county inspector called from a blocked number at dinner time. No county inspector hung up when questioned. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that right up until the second Friday of October at nearly 8 in the evening when a knock landed on my front door. I opened it, expecting Eleanor with another dish I didn't need. Instead, a man I had never seen before stood on my porch, hands loose at his sides, a gray sedan parked crooked at the curb behind him. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. "My name's Danny Reyes. I'm a private investigator. I think we should talk." I did not say anything. I stood in the doorway with my hand still on the frame, the ocean air cold behind me, and I looked at him the way I used to look at a seam that wasn't lying flat, like I already knew where the problem was. I just needed him to show me.
"Come in," I said.
"Coffee's on." He blinked. I don't think that was the reaction he'd rehearsed in the car. His name was Danny Reyes. He told me that part standing on my porch, before I'd even opened the door wider, like he needed to say it out loud to a witness before he lost his nerve. 34 years old. He had the build of someone who used to play some sport in college and had stopped moving enough to keep the shape of it. He wore a gray fleece with a coffee stain on the cuff, the kind of stain that comes from drinking in a car, not at a table. I put the kettle back on the stove instead of the electric one. It's slower. It gives you something to listen to besides silence. "Sit," I said, and he did, at my kitchen table, in Eleanor's grandmother's chair, and I watched him notice the quilt frame in the corner, half a Carolina lily pattern pinned and waiting, and something in his face softened before he caught himself. "Mrs. Whitaker, I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." "All right." "Your son hired me 6 weeks ago, right after you found that car parked outside your gate at the end of September." He said the date like it had been sitting in his mouth for a while, waiting to come out clean. "He paid me $4,000 up front to find out what you were doing out here, what the garage was, who you were talking to, whether you were," he stopped. "Whether I was what, Danny?" He looked at the table. His words were, "She's not all there anymore, Danny."
"Grief does that."
"I just need documentation." The kettle ticked on the burner. I did not flinch, though something in my chest did a small, cold turn, like a key in a lock that doesn't want to give. "And are you," I said.
"Documenting."
I was. He met my eyes then, which I gave him credit for. "For the first 2 weeks, yeah. I sat outside. I ran your plates. I pulled the deed on this place and the DMV file on the Aston Martin, because a car like that registered to a 68-year-old widow raises flags for a guy like Jonathan. This morning I even called the number for the garage on Delmont Road myself, just to see who'd pick up. Turned out that was your lawyer's paralegal, not you, and that cost me 2 days figuring out. That was the call Marcus had mentioned. I filed it away and kept my face still. "But then," he said, and pulled at the fleece cuff, "then I watched you, ma'am. 6 weeks. You go to the fabric shop on Ocean Avenue every Tuesday and you talk to the owner about thread count like it's scripture. You had that woman next door, Eleanor, over for dinner 4 times. You drive that Aston Martin at exactly 41 miles an hour on the coast road, both hands on the wheel, like you're scared of it and in love with it at the same time. You called your accountant twice to ask questions I looked up afterward, and they were sharp questions, ma'am. Smarter than half my clients ask." He shook his head. "There is nothing wrong with your mind. There's a woman here who buried her husband and got thrown out onto the street by her own son, and she's putting her life back together one Tuesday at a time. That's not confusion. That's the opposite of confusion." I let that sit. Then I said, "So why are you telling me this instead of telling him?" "Because 3 days ago he called me and said the assignment changed." Danny's jaw worked. He's not just watching anymore. He's building a file. For a lawyer. He used the word conservatorship, Mrs. Whitaker. He said if we can show a pattern, erratic spending, isolation, unusual relationships, a judge might agree you need someone else managing your assets. He said, and I'm quoting him because I wrote it down the second I hung up, she inherited a garage. She didn't inherit a brain that still works right. I have folded a lot of hard things into small, manageable shapes in my life. A husband's diagnosis he wouldn't say out loud. A son's coldness at a funeral. This was just one more thing to fold. I picked up the kettle before it screamed and poured 2 cups, and my hand did not shake, and I noticed that it did not shake, and I was grateful to it. What do you want, Danny? I said, setting his cup in front of him. You didn't drive out here to confess. You could have just cashed his check and gone home. He wrapped both hands around the mug like it was cold outside, instead of just inside him. I don't know yet, he said. Part of me needs that money. My daughter starts at Cabrillo College in January, and her mother and I split things badly. Part of me looks at you and thinks about my own mother, who nobody ever tried to protect from anybody, and I think I don't want to be the reason this happens to you. That's an honest answer. It's not a complete one. He reached into the fleece and set something on the table between us. Small, black, plastic, ordinary. A USB drive, the kind you'd buy in a 3-pack at a drugstore. What is that? Everything, he said. Every report I sent him. Every photo. And a recording I made 2 days ago. Of a phone call I probably shouldn't have recorded. Of your son talking to a lawyer named Ferris about how to file the petition and what a judge would need to see. He stood up, pushed the chair in with more care than the moment required, like he needed his hands to be doing something correct. I haven't decided who I work for anymore, Mrs. Whitaker. I mean that honestly, but I think you should hear this before you decide who to trust. He was at the door before I could ask him to explain further, the cold coming in around him, the quilt frame catching the last of the porch light behind me. Listen to it, he said, before you decide who to trust. The porch light buzzed behind me for a long moment before I closed the door. I stood there with the USB in my palm, small and gray, weighing almost nothing and somehow the heaviest object I had held since the day I signed for Robert's ashes. I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, the one Eleanor had helped me set up in October, and I plugged the drive in at 11:14 p.m. There was a folder labeled Audio 10-14, a report labeled Surveillance Log, and a third file with no name at all. I opened the audio first. Jonathan's voice came through tinny and close, like he was speaking into a phone held too near his mouth. A second voice, unfamiliar, dry and clipped, answered him. The standard is diminished capacity, the second voice said. Judges want a pattern. One eccentric decision doesn't get you there. You need 3 for incidents that read as confusion. She moved to some coastal town 2 hours from anyone she knows, Jonathan said. She's driving a car worth more than most people's houses. She's taking up with strangers. That's not a pattern to you, Ferris? It's a start. I sat very still. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, the ocean was doing what it always did, indifferent to me, to Jonathan, to any of it. My father left her a garage, Jonathan went on.
A garage, Ferris.
And 3 weeks later she's suddenly got a beach house and a British sports car. Either someone's taking advantage of a confused old woman, or she's hiding something, and either way that's grounds to petition. I'll need medical records. Any diagnosis, any medication, any fall. There was a fall, 2 years ago, in the kitchen. Nothing serious, but it's documented. I remembered that fall. I had slipped on a wet tile reaching for a mixing bowl. Robert had laughed and called me graceful as a cat, and I had laughed too, and we had never once mentioned it to a doctor because it never occurred to us it needed mentioning. I closed the laptop. 3 days later the papers came by certified mail, and I signed for them standing in my own doorway in my robe, the paper heavier in my hand than a single sheet should have been. Petition for evaluation of capacity. My name typed out formal and strange, Susan Marie Whitaker, like I was a stranger being discussed in a room I wasn't allowed into. I called Marcus. He didn't sound surprised, which somehow frightened me more than if he had. He's moving faster than I expected, Marcus said. I'll file a response by Thursday. Susan, listen to me. This is a delay tactic. It rarely works, but it works long enough to cost you money and time, and that may be the entire point. He told a lawyer I fell in my kitchen 2 years ago. Did you fall? I slipped. Robert was standing right there. Then that's what we'll say. A slip, witnessed, no injury, no treatment sought. That's not a pattern, that's a Tuesday. I wanted to believe him. My cousin Deb called that same week, her voice careful in a way that told me before her words did. Jonathan says you're not doing well, she said. He says you've been confused. Forgetting things. He's worried, Susan. I'm not confused, Deb. I'm sure you're not. I wanted to hear it from you. That was the part that lodged under my ribs and stayed there. Not Jonathan's accusation, which I had braced for since Danny's visit, but the fact that it had already traveled. It had a shape now, moving through the family like weather, reaching people before I could. I thought about the garage. I thought about 11 months of building something quiet and mine, and how fast a single word, unstable, could undo it if enough people repeated it. There was an evening, near the end of that week, when I sat with the settlement papers Ferris's office had sent through Marcus. A quiet offer. Withdraw from any claim to contest guardianship terms, agree to a voluntary financial reviewer of Jonathan's choosing, and the petition would be dropped. No hearing. No public airing of anything. I had the pen in my hand. You don't have to sign that tonight, Marcus had told me on the phone earlier, and I remembered thinking, tonight, as if there were a version of me who would sign it tomorrow instead, calmer, more resigned. I looked at the blank line under my name, and I thought about Robert and how he never once raised his voice at Jonathan even when the boy deserved it, and how maybe that gentleness was its own kind of mistake. Then I got up and went to the hall closet, the one Eleanor had helped me build shelving into, and I took down my mother's quilting bin. 51 years old, the fabric inside it. Scraps from dresses I wore as a girl, from a shirt of my father's, from the baby blanket I'd made for Jonathan before he was born, back when I still believed love was something you stitched once, and it simply held. I ran my thumb along the edge of a square my mother had cut in 1961. It hadn't come apart yet. Nothing she'd sewn ever had. I put the pen down. I didn't sign. I need proof, I thought, not that I'm stable, but that he isn't. Marcus had said as much on the phone without quite saying it, that the strongest defense wasn't showing a judge that Susan Whittaker was fine. It was showing that Jonathan's own finances were the ones unraveling. I didn't have that proof yet, but I knew now what I was looking for. The phone rang at 10:40, later than anyone but Marcus usually called. I almost let it go. Mom, Priya said, and her voice was doing something I hadn't heard from her before, something close to breaking open. Mom, I need to see you. I have something you should look at. Priya's number lit up my phone screen before I even had it to my ear. I'm coming to Carmel, she said.
No hello.
Her voice had a flatness I hadn't heard from her before, not even at Robert's funeral. Tomorrow morning. I need to show you something, and I don't want to say it over the phone. I stood in my kitchen with a dish towel still in my hand, water running in the sink behind me. Does Jonathan know?
No.
A pause. And he can't. She arrived at 9:15 the next morning in a gray Lexus I didn't recognize, wearing sunglasses she didn't take off until she was inside my front hall. Her blazer looked slept in. She was carrying a leather satchel pressed flat against her body with both arms, the way you carry something you're afraid of dropping. Coffee? I asked, because I didn't know what else to say to a woman who looked like she hadn't slept. Please. She sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd been piecing a caramel blue quilt block the night before, scraps still scattered across one end. She looked at the fabric like it belonged to a life she'd forgotten existed. You're really doing that?
Sewing.
He told everyone you'd lost the thread on things. His words. I set a mug in front of her. Steam rose between us. I know what he told everyone. Priya wrapped both hands around the mug without drinking from it. The bank called me 3 weeks ago. Not Jonathan's bank, mine. A joint line of credit I didn't know existed, opened against the penthouse 11 months ago. $61,000 outstanding for missed payments. She said the number the way you'd read out a diagnosis. I called Jonathan. He said it was a mistake, that he'd handle it. I believed him for 1 week. And then I found the second mortgage. She reached into the satchel and set a folder on the table between the fabric scraps, not opening it yet, just laying her palm flat on top of it like she needed to steady herself before she let it go. Adler Place has been leveraged twice, Susan. Once 11 years ago, which I knew about, that was for the Meridian project, it paid off fine. But there's a second one, 8 months old, for $110,000, and the signature on it isn't mine even though the form says joint. He traced my signature. I found the practice sheet in his desk. Actual practice sheets, like a child forging a hall pass. I sat down slowly across from her. Outside, a gull was screaming over something on the beach path, and I let the sound fill the silence for a second because I needed it. "Why are you telling me this?" I said, "instead of a lawyer of your own?" Her jaw tightened. "Because a week ago your nephew's wife, Deb, called me asking if I'd sign an affidavit saying you'd seemed confused at Thanksgiving. Jonathan asked me to write it. He'd already drafted it. All I had to do was sign." Her eyes came up to mine, wet now, angry in a way that had nowhere else to go. "I have a 9-year-old daughter, Susan. I am not putting my name on a lie that could take a grandmother's rights away so my husband can cover a debt he built lying to both of us." I thought about the elevator, about Priya standing in that hallway 3 weeks ago, saying nothing while Jonathan pushed my suitcases through the closing doors. I thought I'd have to carry that silence as evidence of who she was. "You didn't say anything that night," I said. "Not cruel, just true." "I know." She didn't look away. "I've replayed it every night since. I told myself it wasn't my fight. I told myself you'd be fine. That Robert must have left you something that Jonathan wouldn't really." She stopped. "I was wrong about all of it. And I'm done being quiet because it's easier." She opened the folder. Bank statements, a printout of wire transfers to 3 different real estate ventures, Holbrook Commons, Tidewater Flats, a third one I didn't recognize called Sorrel Ridge, each one bleeding money instead of making it. A forged signature line, side by side with her real one. Close enough to fool a bank teller, but not close enough to fool a wife who'd signed her name 10,000 times. "This is what he's been building for a year," Priya said, "while he was telling people you couldn't manage your own affairs." I turned the pages slowly. My hands didn't shake, which surprised me. Somewhere behind my ribs there was something that wanted to feel triumphant, and something else, quieter, that just felt tired for him, for the boy who used to fall asleep on Robert's chest during long car rides, who was somewhere inside this man drowning in numbers he couldn't outrun. "What do you want to do with this?" I asked her. "I don't want to destroy him." She said it fast, like she'd rehearsed, making sure I understood that first. "I want him to stop. I want the guardianship filing dropped before it ever reaches a judge, and I want my daughter to have a father who isn't in prison for fraud. But I'm not protecting him anymore at your expense. That's over." We sat with that for a moment, 2 women who had each spent decades making themselves smaller for the same man's comfort. "Then we don't burn it down," I said finally. "We make him look at it. All of it in daylight, with people in the room who can't be talked out of what they're seeing." Priya nodded, and for the first time that morning, she drank her coffee. "There's one more thing," she said, setting the mug down. "Marcus Bell called the house last week, asking to speak to Jonathan about a garage on Delmont Road. Jonathan told him it was a wrong number and hung up. I don't think it was a wrong number, Susan. I think he's scared of something in that garage, and I think it isn't the cars." I filed that away next to the memory of the strange sedan I'd first noticed at the end of September, idling near the gate for no reason anyone could explain. 2 threads now, pulling toward the same place. That's when the television in my living room, still murmuring the mid-morning news I'd forgotten to shut off, cut to a business anchor's voice sharpening with the particular urgency reserved for money stories. I heard the words before I saw the screen. A regional development fund, over-leveraged, filing for receivership overnight. Sorrel Ridge was named in the second sentence. My phone rang on the counter behind me. Jonathan's name lit up the screen. The first call from him in 4 months. I answered on the third ring. Mom. His voice cracked in a way I hadn't heard since he was 9 years old, the year he broke his arm falling off Danny Kessler's roof, and called me from a stranger's kitchen phone. I need to talk to you. Please. I stood in Eleanor's driveway with the phone against my ear and the ocean wind pulling at my sweater. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Tomorrow, I said. Not on the phone. He didn't argue. That told me something too. The hearing was set for the following Thursday at the Monterey County Courthouse, a squat beige building on Church Street with metal detectors that beeped every time Eleanor walked through in her orthopedic shoes. Marcus had flown in the night before with a leather folder thick enough to stop a bullet. Priya sat 2 rows behind Jonathan, not beside him, and I noticed he noticed. Judge Alvarez had reading glasses pushed up into gray hair and a voice that never rose above conversational. Jonathan's attorney, a narrow man named Ferris in a suit slightly too big for him, stood first. Your Honor, we have serious concerns about Mrs. Whitaker's ability to manage significant assets following a period of profound grief and disorientation. He clicked through photographs on a screen, the garage, the Aston Martin, Eleanor's porch. She relocated abruptly to an unfamiliar town, associated with strangers, and took possession of high-value vehicles she has no documented experience operating. I watched Jonathan while Ferris talked. He didn't look at me once. Mrs. Whitaker fell in her kitchen 11 months ago, Ferris continued. We have medical records. I slipped on a wet floor, I said quietly to Marcus. His hand touched my arm.
Not yet, the touch said.
When it was our turn, Marcus stood slowly, the way he did everything, like he had all day and intended to use it. Your Honor, I'd like to enter Exhibit A, the Whitaker Family Trust, established 14 years ago, amended 9 years ago upon Robert Whitaker's cardiac diagnosis. He slid the folder across. This trust names Susan Whitaker as sole trustee of assets totaling approximately $11.4 million in vehicles, plus rental income of $18,000 monthly from properties she personally manages, collecting rents, approving tenants, filing quarterly tax documents herself. Judge Alvarez looked up. Herself. Yes, Your Honor. I have 3 tenants prepared to testify to that if needed. Eleanor was called next. She smoothed her skirt and sat up very straight in the witness chair, the way I imagined she once sat across from museum donors asking for 6-figure checks. I managed the classic car collection at the Monterey Heritage Museum for 19 years, she said. Susan asked me, unprompted, about proper humidity control for the Gullwings leather interior within a week of moving in. She keeps maintenance logs by hand. She identified a coolant leak in the Ferrari before I did. She looked at Jonathan. I've met confused people. She isn't one. Ferris tried to shake her on cross. He didn't manage it. Then Danny stood, and I felt the room's attention shift toward him. I was hired by Jonathan Whitaker in September, he said, to surveil Susan Whitaker and document any behavior suggesting diminished capacity. He didn't look away from Jonathan. Over 6 weeks, I found the opposite. I told Mr. Whitaker that in October. He asked me to keep looking anyway. When I said there was nothing to find, he asked whether I could describe her routine as, quote, erratic. A murmur went through the gallery. I refused. I gave my complete file to Mrs. Whitaker instead. Jonathan's jaw moved. Still, he said nothing.
Priya was last.
She wore a gray suit I didn't recognize, and her hands were steady when she opened her own folder. I'm an accountant. I'm also Jonathan's wife. A pause, small and precise. I discovered in March that he took a second mortgage against our penthouse, $410,000, using a signature that was not mine. I've since confirmed $61,000 in undisclosed debt and losses from an investment fund called Sorrel Ridge, which defaulted 11 days ago. She set bank statements on the table like she was laying down cards she'd been holding a long time. He asked me to sign an affidavit stating his mother was, in his words, slipping. I refused that too. The room went very quiet. I watched something go out of Jonathan's face, not anger. Something underneath it. Judge Alvarez took off her glasses. Mr. Ferris, Does your client wish to respond? Jonathan stood. His mouth opened. Nothing came for a second, 2 seconds, and I understood, watching him, that I was looking at a man discovering in real time that the story he'd told himself for months had a different ending than the one he'd planned. No further response, Your Honor, Ferris said for him. The petition for conservatorship was denied in 11 minutes. I didn't feel the thing I thought I'd feel. I'd imagined this moment for weeks, imagined it tasting like victory. Instead, I watched my son gather his coat off the back of his chair with hands that weren't quite steady, and I thought about the boy who used to fall asleep in the car with his cheek against the window, and I felt something closer to grief than triumph. Marcus touched my elbow. Susan, you did well. I nodded, but I was still watching Jonathan's back as he walked out ahead of us, alone, no one beside him. In the hallway, under fluorescent light that made everyone look faintly ill, he was waiting by the elevator. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and I saw his eyes were red-rimmed, his tie loosened, the confident line of his shoulders gone entirely. Mom. His voice had nothing left in it, no anger, no strategy, nothing performed. I lost everything. I don't know where to go. I did not answer. I looked at him standing there in the fluorescent light of the courthouse hallway, still in the suit he'd worn to try to prove I was losing my mind, and I let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable for both of us. Not here, I said. We met 3 days later, at the kitchen table in the Carmel house, the one with the salt air window Robert never got to see finished. Marcus sat to my right with a folder. Priya sat across from Jonathan, close enough to touch his arm but not touching it. Danny stood by the door, arms crossed, the way a man stands when he isn't sure if he's still needed. Jonathan looked smaller than he had at the hearing. The suit was the same one, but it had started to hang on him. The penthouse sold Tuesday, he said. Foreclosure auction. $290,000 under what I owed on it. He said the number like it cost him something to say out loud. Sorrel Ridge is gone. My license is under review. I have $4,000 in checking and a storage unit in Van Nuys, with what's left of the furniture. I know, I said. Marcus has been keeping me informed. His head came up at that. You've been watching. I've been paying attention. There's a difference. I folded my hands on the table, the way I used to when a fabric order came in wrong, and I had to decide whether it was worth the argument. You tried to have me declared incompetent 3 weeks ago, Jonathan. I'm allowed to pay attention. Priya's hand found the table edge, not his arm. Still not his arm. I'm not asking for the trust, Jonathan said. His voice had a rawness in it I hadn't heard since he was 9 years old and broke his arm falling off the Delmont Road fence trying to see over it. I'm asking for help. As my mother. I said nothing to that yet. He still believed I'd come into some cars and a lucky trust, nothing more. He had no idea the true number sat 7 figures beyond anything he'd imagined, and I meant to let him go on not knowing a little while longer. Some things a person has to earn the right to hear. Then you'll listen to the terms, I said, before you decide if you still want to ask. Marcus opened the folder. He didn't slide it across the table yet. He held it, the way a man holds something he wants you to earn before you get to look at it. First, I said, every account you have, every debt, every card, goes through Marcus. Not me. Him. Full transparency, updated monthly, no exceptions, no accounts I don't know about. If I find $1 hidden the way you hid the $410,000 against the penthouse, this ends. Permanently. Jonathan flinched at the number. Priya didn't. She already knew it by heart. She was the one who'd found it.
Second.
Any money that comes to you from me doesn't come to you. It goes into an independent trust Marcus administers. You draw against it for specific, approved purposes. Housing, retraining, debt resolution. Not markets. Not another Sorrel Ridge. I understand, Jonathan said quietly. Third. I paused here because this was the one I'd rehearsed the least and meant the most. You start therapy? Not once. Not until the paperwork's signed and you feel better. Weekly for as long as it takes, with someone Marcus vets, so I know you're not performing for a rubber stamp. I want the man who did that to me in the hallway of Adler Place to be a stranger to you in 5 years. I don't think that happens on its own. He didn't answer right away. His jaw worked. I watched him decide whether to argue, and then watched him decide not to. And fourth, I said, you stop building towers for people who already have everything. You take what you know about property and put it towards something that matters. Affordable housing. Real housing for people who work 40 hours a week and still can't find a place. Marcus has already found 2 firms in the East Bay that would take you on if you show up different than you left. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator humming and, somewhere outside, a gull complaining over the tide pools. Jonathan looked at his hands for a long moment. Then, he put his face in them. I didn't move to comfort him. I let it happen. A man has to cry sometimes without his mother rushing in to make it easier, or he never learns what the tears are for. Okay, he said, finally muffled. He looked up, and his eyes were wrecked, but there was nothing performing in them. Okay, all of it. I don't want to negotiate. I just want, he stopped. Started again. I want to be someone you don't have to protect yourself from. Priya's hand moved then. It landed on his shoulder, light, testing. Danny, by the door, said nothing, but I saw him uncross his arms. Marcus finally slid the folder across the table. Jonathan signed without reading it first, which told me more than the tears had. There's one more thing, I said, once the pen was down. I reached into my cardigan pocket and set a single brass key on the table between us. It caught the window light. This isn't the trust. It isn't money. It's Delmont Road. He stared at it like it might move. I'm not giving you what's inside, I said. It's not mine to give away, and it's not yours to inherit twice. But I think it's time you saw what your father actually left. All of it. And maybe then you'll understand why he did what he did to you at that reading, and why I let him. Jonathan stood in the doorway of the garage a long moment, looking at the Aston Martin like it might still bite him. Then he stepped inside anyway, ran a hand along the fender, and said nothing. That was new. A year ago, he would have already found something to say. You painted the trim, he said finally, nodding at the little office in the corner. Eleanor helped. He nodded again. He looked thinner than he had in October, in a way that suited him. Not gaunt, just less padded with excess he used to carry like armor. He'd sold the boat in March. The membership at the club in April. Marcus told me the numbers, but I didn't need the numbers. I could see it in how he held his shoulders now, like a man who'd stopped performing weight he didn't have. Groundbreaking's Thursday, he said. The Willow Street project. 42 units. I wanted you to come if you want to. I'll be there. Priya's driving up separately. She's bringing the girls. He hesitated, and I watched him decide to say the next part instead of swallowing it, which a year ago he also would not have done. Dr. Okonkwo says, I should tell you when I notice myself doing the old thing. Deflecting. So, I'm doing that right now. I came here to say thank you, and I'm talking about groundbreakings instead. I set down the rag I'd been using to wipe dust off the Ferrari's hood. Thank you for what, specifically? He didn't flinch at the specifically. That was new too. For not walking away last October. When you could have. When most people would have. I thought about it. I know. He almost smiled. Priya told me. She said you sat with the papers for 2 hours before you called Marcus. 2 hours and 40 minutes actually at the kitchen table in Carmel, the fog coming in gray through the window, my quilting squares spread out beside the folder like they might vote on it. I'd thought about the elevator. The suitcases. Useless old woman. I'd thought about it, and then I'd called Marcus anyway because holding a grudge with both hands meant I had no hands left for anything else, and I was 68 years old and tired of empty hands. You don't owe me a speech, Jonathan. I know. I'm giving you one anyway. He looked at the gullwing's door, half open, catching the light. I used to think this garage was the insult, the joke he played on you. I used to think the penthouse was the win. He shook his head slowly. It took me losing the penthouse to understand he wasn't testing whether I'd win. He was testing what I'd do with you once I thought I had. I let that sit in the garage with us. Outside, a gull was arguing with another gull over something on the pier, and I could hear it through the half-open bay door, that raw scraping cry that never sounds like it belongs anywhere near a coastline this pretty. I failed it, he said. I know that. You did. No sense pretending otherwise. He wasn't asking me to. And then you didn't fail the next one. He looked at me like that surprised him, and I realized this was the first time in a year I'd said something to him that wasn't a condition or a correction. Just an observation. Just true. He left an hour later, promising Thursday, and I stood in the garage by myself for a while after his car pulled out, listening to it fade down Delmont Road. Then I went to the office corner and took out the envelope Marcus had given me 2 weeks before, not the earlier one marked not yet, see Marcus. This was newer. Marcus had held it separately, sealed, with instructions that I only get it once the guardianship matter had fully closed and once, his exact words, relayed through Marcus's careful reading of Robert's own handwriting. Once Jonathan has shown you who he actually is, not who I was afraid he'd become. I'd been putting off opening it for 11 days. I don't entirely know why. Maybe because as long as it stayed sealed, there was one more thing Robert had left for me to open, one more small proof he hadn't finished loving me before he ran out of time. Once it was open, that would be the last one. I sat down at the desk that had been his and slit the envelope with a letter opener that had also been his, and inside was a single folded page and a small black box. The letter was short. Robert was never a man who used 10 words when 4 would do. Susan, I had this made the spring before the diagnosis got worse, before I knew how much time I had. I told the jeweler it was for our anniversary. I was going to give it to you on an ordinary Tuesday for no reason, the way I used to bring you fabric remnants from the hardware store just because the pattern reminded me of you. I never found the right ordinary Tuesday. There's no good way to say I'm sorry for that, so I won't try. Wear it next to the other one. Let it mean I was always coming back to you, even in the parts of the plan that looked like I was leaving.
Ed.
Inside the box was a ring, platinum, a single garnet set low and simple, my birthstone, nothing like the modest gold band I'd worn for years and still wore. I slid it onto my finger beside the old one. They didn't match exactly. They fit anyway, the way two things can belong together without being identical, the way a garage full of steel and chrome had turned out to be the truest room in a life built mostly out of penthouses and appearances. Thursday, after the groundbreaking, after the shovels and the borrowed hard hats and Priya's daughters chasing gulls across the lot where 42 families would eventually live, I drove the Aston Martin home along the coast road by myself, top down, the light going copper over the water the way it does here in early evening. Eleanor says I drive it too fast for a woman my age. Eleanor is right. I used to think the hardest thing love asks of you is forgiveness. I don't think that anymore. I think the hardest thing it asks is the discipline to protect the people you love from themselves, even when they call you useless for doing it, even when it costs you 3 weeks of grief spent alone before you find out the man who married you was thinking of you the whole time. Robert gave me a garage nobody thought was worth anything. It turned out to be the only inheritance that mattered. Not the cars, not the money. The proof.